Welcome everyone. Today is the lecture 2 of climate change extreme events. In this lecture particularly, we will talk about what is exactly climate change, how we can understand it from different types of mechanism, different types of factors and all. So in the last lecture, lecture 1, we have briefed detailed about what is exactly weather, what is exactly climate, and how we can differentiate between, let's say, weather and climate based on certain different processes, or let's say temporal scale or spatial scale, like that. Then we have also discussed about some sort of different types of mechanism which are common in different weather types of events and also in the climate events. In this lecture particularly, we will talk about what is climate change and how we can introduce them, and what are their different factors which is basically responsible for climate change. In the last lecture, we had discussed about, let's say, climate. Climate is basically the average behavior of meteorological parameter in one particular locations. When we are talking about, let's say, climate change, which means that the average behavior of the meteorological properties of one particular locations is likely to be changed or has been changed already because of some sort of stressors. It is either it can be your natural driver, or it can be some sort of human made or human induced drivers as well. So this is basically called change in the property or change in the state of meteorological system at a particular location, that is called climate change. But most of the time when we are referring to climate change, we are saying this is basically the human led alterations of climate behavior of certain locations or globally. For example, if you talk about several types of changing weather patterns, changing, let's say you are talking about rising sea levels, then you are also talking about, let's say, ocean changes, and also different types of feedback loops, which we have already discussed in the last lecture about the positive feedbacks or negative feedbacks, like that. And how do we know these information basically? So these information, either we can get idea about, let's say, some sort of in situ data set, which are instrumentation based records, or maybe we can get the data about whether the climate is changing or not in a particular location based on some sort of paleoclimate or old records of the data set, or maybe, let's say, satellite observations can also help to address or identify those regions where these phenomena are very common. So therefore, in this particular lecture, we will talk about what is exactly climate change and how we can introduce them based on different types of factors. So overall, the learning objectives of this particular lecture is, first we will go through the climate change and distinguish it from the natural variability. Then we will talk about what is the role of greenhouse gases. First we will introduce about, let's say, what is greenhouse effect and how these greenhouse gases amplifies the climate change or accelerate the climate behavior or change properties, for example. Then we will also explore some of the historical and current evidence of climate change based on different types of records as well. And then we will also briefly talk about what is the implications, for example, what is the mitigation strategies or what is the adaptation strategies to deal with the changing climate conditions and their different form-ups results, for example, increased flood event, increased drought events, or heat waves, or forest fire, for example. So these are the things we will discuss in this particular lecture. So what is exactly climate change? As we just described, so when we are saying that there is a long-term change in the temperature, or let's say precipitation, or the wind patterns, or other types of climate elements or meteorological properties which has a long-term change in the behavior. We have recorded the, let's say, temperature, precipitation of one place, monthly values, you have seasonal fluctuations, you have annual fluctuations and all, but when you look at the data set for let us say 30-40 years or in the longer record, you compare what has happened let us say in the past few decades and what has happened in the current decades. So, that is what exactly we say that there is a long term change in the temperature or other different properties that can attribute to a change in the climate behavior or of a particular locations. What is the exact drivers of these changes? One can identify that there are two drivers. One can be the natural driver and other can be human induced driver. So, if you talk about let us say natural driver, which can be classified as let us say volcanic eruptions, it can also sometimes change the climate conditions, solar radiations, oceans currents, orbital change and natural greenhouse gases as well. So, these are the some of the factors which are responsible for let us say the changing in the behavior of a natural system, and that leads to your climate change of different regions as well. Then there is another factors which are purely driven by human activities or anthropogenic factors. For example, let us say you talk about fossil fuel combustion, where you increase the amount of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere and therefore that accelerate the process of climate change. And let us say if you talk about reforestation, that basically changes the albedo of the earth's surface, and that therefore it is also alter the earth's energy budget some way. And let us say you talk about industrial processes, which is also sometimes responsible for increasing the amount of greenhouse gases and different types of alterations that can lead to climate conditions and well. Let us say if you talk about agricultural practices, that is also responsible for changes the land use land cover characteristics, and that is basically changes the albedo or reflection or absorption characteristics of land use surfaces, and therefore that is also responsible for let us say change in the climatic behavior in the longer term or longer period of records. Waste management can also lead to sometimes the change in the behavior of climate change because of the gases and some other which is originated from these waste management as well. So, therefore, there are primarily there are two factors which basically drives the climate change at a particular locations or overall the globe. One is your natural factor and another is your anthropogenic factors. So, before jumping into the major science behind let us say climate change, we need to understand about what is exactly greenhouse gas effect, because when greenhouse gas effect is very important phenomena, which is basically maintains the energy or heat of the earth at certain level, so that our planet can be a habitable stage. For example, greenhouse gas plays a very critical role in climate change. There are certain gases which traps the heat which is coming from let us say in the long wave radiation form and basically stores and then re-radiate back to the atmosphere. Therefore, it is maintains the earth's temperature in certain degrees. Therefore, it can provide the optimum temperature so that the vegetation can grow, and therefore multiple different ecological processes can work together at the surface of earth. Let us say if you talk about if there is no greenhouse gas effect, there will be the temperature of the earth's surface on an average is around -18°C, or let us say if you consider greenhouse gas effect in the earth's environment or atmosphere, then the temperature of the earth would be around around 15°C like that. So, what is exactly greenhouse gas effect? It is basically let us say you have a source sun where some amount of radiations are emitted towards the target. Target is here is your earth's surface, and let us say this is in your short wave radiation format. So, some of these radiations pass through the dense cloud or dense troposphere or atmosphere of earth and reaches to the ground, and because of the ground conditions, land use land cover characteristics, some amount of short wave radiations are absorbed by the earth's surface, and therefore after some time, after some period of time, these radiation which is absorbed by these land use characteristics are re-emitted back to the atmosphere, which is in the form of long wave radiations, and these long wave radiations somehow trapped in your atmospheric gases, which is can be your carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, or let's say water vapor. So therefore these are the longer wave radiation which are which will be trapped by these different types of gases, which basically increases the earth's surface temperature because of the trapping of the heat in these different gases in the atmospheres like that. So this is over exactly the what is greenhouse gas effect in for earth's atmosphere. When we talk about climate change, we essentially refer to the enhanced greenhouse gas effect. Why? Because when we are talking about climate change, we are essentially referring to the human-led climate alterations or human-led activities which increases the temperature of Earth. How it is happening? Because let's say human activities increases the greenhouse gases emissions, GHG concentrations, leading to trapping the more heat, because these GHG concentrations gases are greenhouse gases primarily, and therefore it absorbed the long wave radiation which is coming from Earth's characteristics, Earth's surfaces, and therefore it is trapping more and more heat when you have more greenhouse gas concentration in the Earth's atmosphere like that. For example, if you talk about burning of fossil fuels, deforestation, agricultural activities, or industrial processes, all leads to changes in the Earth's surface energy budget, and therefore it accelerates somehow your greenhouse gases effect in the atmosphere, and that is somehow increases your the energy or temperature of your overall Earth surface. So this is one of the plot which tells about, let's say if you increases the since 1970, it gives you an idea about what is the global carbon emissions since 1970. So it is continuously rising till 2020, and therefore it is also suggesting that there are two different types of gases here. If you are considering, let's say CO2 and CH4. CH4 is also kind of GHG gas, which is also responsible for trapping more long wave radiations and therefore increasing the Earth's temperature. So there are several agreements has been signed by different international authorities and all, which tries to minimize these greenhouse gas emission by certain degrees, therefore so that we can have stabilize the increment of our Earth's surface temperature by, let's say, 2 degree, 1.5 degree and all that. So therefore this is the plot which gives you an idea about how these greenhouse gases are concentration are increasing every years, and therefore that leads to changes in the Earth's properties and all. So basically what is the evidence of this climate change? When you talk about this greenhouse gases effect, it has been enhanced, and therefore we have more climate change issues. So what are their evidences? For example, if you talk about different types of extreme weather events, which can be your hurricanes, which can be your droughts events, meteorological droughts events, or let's say wildfire events. If you talk about, let's say, sea level rise, then there are more frequent occurrences of, let's say, flooding, coastal flooding, land erosions and all. If you're talking about, let's say, rising temperature, that can lead to your global warming, the overall rise of the temperature of Earth, and also, let's say, more frequency and more severity of heat waves in a different parts of the world as well. And also, let's say you're talking about melting ice, then we also see that okay, there are several glaciers which are retreating, several are on the verge of extension like that, and there are also we have observed there is a significant melting of polar ice in polar the higher or the negative direction, the higher latitude as well. So these are some of the evidences which suggest that okay, there are some degree of climate has been changed, and that is resulted in different types of events which are threatening the socio-economic conditions of different regions like that. So this is another plot which tells you about how the temperature of the Earth's surface has been increased since, let's say, 1860 to till date. And you can see it here that after 1960 particularly, when this industrialization and all these things are begin, you can see that there is a sharp rise of your temperature since then. And now if you talk about, let's say in 2024, and so we have already crossed that 1.5 degree increment threshold, which has been already set up by various different international authorities and all. So all these sources of the data set, either it can be from ERA 5, JRA, Berkeley Earth, or there are several different sources which suggest the similar stories that okay, the global temperature of Earth or surface of Earth is basically increasing, and it is increasing quite significantly if you compare, let's say, from 1960-80s to till date. So this, the rate of the temperature rise is significantly higher compared to the whatever we have seen so far in the historical period as well. So if you talk a little bit more in the historical side, we have already seen several types of the climatic events. For example, there is a ice age, there is medieval warming period, there is a little ice age, and then we have Anthropocene period. So basically, when the ice age and or little ice age, the period where the temperature of Earth was very low, and therefore there are several areas or regions has been covered by the ice and formation of glacier and ice sheets like that. The medieval warm period are those period where we have a rise in the global temperature, and that is basically accelerated the agricultural expansion in different parts of the world as well. The Anthropocene, particularly the period where we are particularly considering the human impacts on climate and environment. So in this particular figure, it is also very visible that whenever we are talking about, let's say, the rise of the global temperature, global mean temperature rise, it is clearly evident from your, let's say, rise of your CO2 or carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. So there is one-to-one correlation between these two properties, which is why it is suggesting that okay, the greenhouse gases concentration is rising, and that is somehow enhancing your greenhouse gas effect, and that is basically overall enhancing the temperature of our surface because of all these activities and all. So in the past, we have basically seen that there are several temperature fluctuation event, but when we talk about, let's say, Anthropocene year or very recent years, it has been observed that the changes in the temperature of Earth's surface has been significantly very steep compared to the historical what we have observed so far in different types of our records, for example, ice core records and all those records like that. So therefore, it is very important to understand about how the human activities led to the changes in the climate conditions, and therefore it is basically responsible for changes in the different types of climate properties in different types of regional behavior like that. So overall, the drivers, if you can classify, there are two drivers. One is the natural drivers, one is the anthropogenic drivers. The primarily, let's say, volcanic activity and the solar radiation variabilities are responsible for more changes in the natural state of climate at globally or regional level, something like that. Or maybe if you talk about, let's say, anthropogenic drivers, which are fossil fuels, we have already discussed, and land use land cover change, which is basically also responsible for change in the climate state at a particular location or overall the global scale as well. When you are talking about, let's say, solar radiation variability, it is basically we are talking about essentially the Milankovitch cycle. So Milankovitch has suggested several different types of properties of Earth, for example, precession, obliquity and eccentricity, and based on these different properties, Milankovitch has been assessed what is their cycle and how these different orientation of Earth has altered the solar radiation, and therefore that basically affects the overall global temperature of Earth's surface. And these properties has certain frequencies, for example 26,000, 41,000 and 1 lakh years like that. So this is how basically each 26,000 there is a change in the precision, 41,000 is basically we have change in the obliquity, the angle, and then we can also see there is a change in the eccentricity, for example at 1 lakh years frequencies like that. So when you talk about impacts of climate change, so we have so far understood about, let's say, what is exactly climate change, what are those drivers which are responsible for these climate change, and how we can differentiate between the different types of drivers and their mechanism like that. So what is overall impact of climate change? It has some sort of economical impacts which can basically damage the infrastructure, or let's say loss of agricultural activities or crops. We have already seen that, let's say, if certain years are declared as a drought year, then we have already the crop productivity or agricultural activity has been severely suffered. Let's say it has also environmental impacts. When you have change in the temperature, let's say heat waves occurrences or more frequent heat waves occurrences, that is basically responsible for loss of the habitat or biodiversity in different region. That is basically the environmental impacts caused by the climate change. Or let's say it has a social impacts as well. For example, it can affect the health risk of a larger population in a certain region. Let's say if you talk about more occurrences of flood, that can lead to let's say more occurrences of waterborne diseases. That can basically health risk in a different different type regions as well. It can also lead to food and water security or availability at particular locations. Let's say when you have more frequent flooding events or more frequent let's say coastal flooding, or let's say more frequent drought events, that can cause your more the food and water security issues in different regions as well. So these are some of the major impact of when we are saying climate change, or let's say human induced climate change, because of the acceleration of greenhouse gas effect. So these are the very good representation of the global countries, where we can see that what is their climate exposures and what is their fragility. For example, it is coming it is showing from low to high, and then fragility also low to highest, like that. So if you see here, most of the tropical regions or the regions, let's say in Africa or Asian region, most of them are are higher in exposure, in the climate exposure, as well as the fragility is also high, which means the climate exposure means here the more frequent climatic extremes events, or more those events which are originated because of the climate change are more frequently occurring. And the fragility is also very high. Let's say the population densities, or let's say poor mitigation or adaptation strategies leads to more socioeconomic or mortality rates in these particular regions. Therefore, in this particular region, it shows that it is very higher fragility as well as the climate exposure of these different countries as well. So what is their different indicators which can we can talk about? Based on that, we can see, okay, the climate is changing. So one is your cryosphere. We can read about multiple news articles, or let's say journal papers, where people are suggesting that, okay, the retreat of glaciers, or Alaskan ice, or Antarctica's ice, or Arctic ice, or Himalayan glaciers, like that, which are retreating, or ice caps has been has been significantly affected by these climate activities. We can also see there is a rise in temperature and acidification in ocean, and which leads to let's say biodiversity loss. Or we have already seen multiple pictures where the animals have been died, the the creatures has been washed away from the shore, or like that. So these are some of the indicators where we see that there is a direct impact of climate on ocean biodiversity, like that. Then we can also see that there is atmospheric changes, where we have seen the greenhouse gases increasing amount, gases in the atmosphere, that is basically somehow changing your greenhouse gas budget as well. So as we have already discussed in the lecture 1, there are some positive impacts, there are some negative feedbacks also. So for example, in this case, there is a positive feedbacks is basically, let's say if you are talking about climate change, if it is more climate change, there will be more melting, and therefore if it is more melting, there is a more melting of ice and ice caps, or let's say glaciers and all. And when we have more melting, that is basically reduce the albedo, surface albedo, and that is basically affect your reflections and absorption of solar electromagnetic radiations like that, and that is somehow directly affect your heat absorption capacity of the different land use land cover properties, and that is basically somehow increases more melting of that particular locations. So this is a kind of positive feedback which happens, that is basically driven by climate change activities. There is a negative impact. For example, let us say if you have negative feedback, so for example, if you have climate change, there is a increased enhanced CO2 or enhanced CO2 conditions, that is basically can increase your vegetation growth, and basically it can enhance more CO2 absorption from the atmosphere, and that is basically sometimes also some kind stabilize the climate conditions in one particular locations or regions like that. So that is also one types of negative feedback that can tries to stabilize the already enhanced greenhouse gas activities or CO2 emission because of the increased vegetation growth and all that. So this is the feedback mechanism which can also be very important to understand in context of climate change as well. So what is the solution for this? So there are, broadly we can divide into two different parts. One is called mitigation, another is called adaptation. These are the ways which we can basically which can really basically which we can. So these are the two conditions where we can basically apply the strategies to address these climate conditions. For example, if you talk about mitigations, mitigation is called those efforts which is basically aimed at reducing the cause of climate change, primarily by lowering let us say greenhouse gases or different types of activities. Let us say if you are talking about active transportation by using some sort of bicycles, low carbon transportation, or waste reduction or waste management, or let us say renewable energy or energy efficient buildings like that. So these are the mitigation steps which are used to, let us say, reduce more greenhouse gases emission in the atmosphere. These are always the longer term global solutions to address the root cause of the climate change and can help us in the longer term time period. On the other hand, when you are talking about, let us say, adaptation involves taking action to adjust to the impact of, let us say, climate change that are already happening or expected to occur, and these adaptation are some call as a short term to cope with the impacts of the climate change. For example, you talk about emergency management or climate resilient buildings or preparing for sea level rise or wildfire resilience or flood protection. These are short term reductions, short term plans which basically reduces the exaggerated effect of climate change on different regions like that. So there are certain plans which can also be applicable in mitigation and adaptation also. Let us say public engagement, let us say water conservations or local food or smart growth. So this can be your short term and long term steps which can help to mitigate or adapt the climate change conditions and all. There are several international agreements which has been already signed. For example, there are Berlin agreement which is signed in 1995, then Kyoto, and then Bali and Copenhagen. In the very recently we have also seen the Azerbaijan Baku the international agreements on different types of. So in the previous we have seen the Paris agreements where we have discussed about the nationally determined contribution of goals for 10 years of all parties, including different types of countries or their financial states, for example. And then we also talk about what is the global warming below 2 degrees or pre-industrial average, what is the ambition of increase with the time, limit temperature which is basically a threshold we have defined like 1.5 degree or 2 degree like that. And then we have also communicating through the report and for different authorities to implement that whatever has been discussed during the Paris. So in terms of when you are talking about, let us say, mitigation or adaptation, so there are several international agreement has been already signed. which are in the direction of, let's say, applying several types of short term or long term adaptation or mitigation plans, so that we can have reduce the exaggerated effect or significant impact of extreme events or climate change impacts on different regions as well. So in this particular talk, we have discussed about what is exactly climate change and how it results from, let's say, different types of natural or anthropogenic factors. We have also discussed about what is the evidence of changes, how we can prove it, what is their impacts, for example, how the climate change has impacted different parts of the world, socioeconomic conditions, or let's say agricultural productivity or health or something like that, we have also discussed. Then we have also discussed, let's say, what is exactly the mitigation and adaptation are critical for, and we have also discussed about what has been happened in the past based on, let's say, different types of international agreements on several types of mitigation and adaptation plannings as well. So you can at the end of this lecture, I would suggest that you can start thinking about what actions can individual take to, let's say, combat climate change in your regions or globally. That can help to, let's say, for short terms or long terms application or, let's say, mitigation processes as well. Thank you very much for the attentions for today's class. In the next class, we will talk about what is exactly the climate extremes, introduction to climate extremes, and different types of we will go through what is exactly how you can define the climate extremes and what is that there are different types of climate extremes which is the result from, for example, the climate change or the change in the climate behavior. Thank you very much.